Hello, welcome back to Slicing in Cura. I spent some time in the previous video talking about positioning, rotation, scaling, etc. I don't really use these. A couple of them are new. Anyway, so we'll go on and look at this panel over here. First of all, it's important that you know what material you're using. In the makerspace, we almost always use PLA. You will see that there are a few PLA choices. I usually use the PLA Village Plastics. So go ahead and go to PLA Village Plastics. Oh, there we go. Okay. I talked about the standard high and low in the first video a little bit. You can see that anytime you make a change over here, it updates the time for you, which is pretty nice. The print setup area and the properties you can choose, there are two ways to look at it. This is kind of the template version where you don't have a say over a lot of the different changes. It basically lets you look at different infills, and I'll show you that in a second. And it allows you to say whether or not you need support, which we don't in this case because we rotated it so it was flat on the bed. And build plate adhesion, I'll explain that in a second. We're also going to look at the custom profile. I always have mine set on custom because I do this so often that sometimes I really need to tweak the settings. But let's go ahead. A skirt basically extrudes a line around what the print will be. I usually keep it on skirt. Depending on what I'm printing, sometimes I use a raft. A raft is like a small layer of filament, like a rectangular layer of filament that will be underneath your print. It helps bed adhesion. And we'll actually talk about that with lithophanes. There's also a brim. Honestly, I don't think I've used a brim and I forget what it is. You can also go with none. I rarely go with none. I usually keep the skirt on. So let's keep that on skirt. So infill, here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to switch this view to layer view. And when we go to layer view, I'm going to zoom in a little bit. When we go to layer view, we can turn this down. Why aren't you letting me go down? Okay, so if I bring this down, you can see the size of these boxes is the infill. So obviously the top is solid, the bottom is solid, and then you can see there's like 3 little lines here. That's called the shell. So this is like the thickness of wall. So that's the shell. If I turn that off, it doesn't show it, which is kind of confusing. So I'm going to put it back on. So the infill is really what we want to see because we're going to look at this divider. So if I pull this down, you can see, and let me rotate it a little bit. So you can see that the infill is a grid pattern and it's set at 20%. Let's push this down to 10%. I have printed at 10% before. I don't think I've ever printed below 10%. So you can see that the time went down, but you can see that it's really sparse, which means that it's possible that the next full layer that goes over this, some of the filament could fall down. So I don't very often print below 20%. It's a pretty good bottom, like minimum. And okay, so this line around it, that's the raft the skirt I was talking about. So suppose And you can see, so 54 minutes, it's probably more than I imagined, but it is what it is. If I really needed to print this quicker, infill is usually the quickest way to do it. And right now, when we're in the recommended area, that's all we have control over. So let's have a look at this custom area. And what it does is it collapses all the categories. So if you want to look at infill specifically, I click this and all of the infill options appear. So you can see that, you know, let's have a look and see what 18 does. And so every time I change something, it reslices. It'll give you another time estimate. And then, you know, I can see the difference it has. That doesn't really have a big difference, so I could probably get away with 18, but it only saved me a minute. So those are the sort of decisions you have to make. Let's say we have a lot of time and we want this to be finer. Let's turn this up to 45%. And usually the things that are indented are calculated based on the outdented things. So I would say don't touch anything indented. In fact, a lot of these things you won't have to touch. You definitely will play with infill density. So you can see that's much, much finer. And it actually was only at the expense of, say, 15 minutes. So if you wanted a stronger thing, you can turn up your infill. Let me show you the infill pattern. So that's interesting that it changed it to lines on me. When I change it to grid, the time's the same. And you can see it a little better. I don't like a lines infill. A lot of times I'll use this infill called gyroid. The reason I like it is because it tends to do a better job even at a lower percentage. So, but watch, it's going to be longer. So that added 10 minutes to what we already had. So you can see that's the kind of infill. But if we turn this down to 20, you will see that it looks more robust than what the grid did. So with the recommended print setup, you don't have access to changing the infill pattern. So that alone is one reason to go to custom. So I never play with that. I use density and infill patterns. I don't usually change the rest of these. So I'm going to collapse this menu. We're going to stick at 20 and gyroid. Quality. Quality is mostly about the layer height. And it's really interesting that in recommended, it doesn't let you tweak that. So the standard layer height is 0.25. That's actually how tall each layer is. So the skinnier these guys are, I don't know if you noticed that high detail has a really small layer height and high speed has a taller layer height, so to speak. So, and it definitely affects the change. Watch what happens, and you really wouldn't notice a difference. If I change this to 0.3, watch the difference it has on the time. So it was 56 minutes just a second ago. And changing it, I just cut my time by 5 minutes, which doesn't seem like a lot, but the more you tweak stuff, the more these little things will help. So in quality, it's really the layer height is the only one you're going to mess with. You could change the shell. I usually don't. The only time I change the shell is if I need something really, really strong. So especially for beginners, you really want to look at layer height. Like, watch what happens if I add 35 to this. And we're also talking about a little trinket that it doesn't matter if it's slightly flawed. It doesn't matter if it's super strong or not super strong. when I'm printing stuff for the robotics teams, we really will pay attention to the layer height and the infill percentage. So look, I cut quite a bit more time off by going to 0.35, which really in this case, you're not going to notice the difference a whole lot. So I'm going to collapse that. So quality has your layer height, infill has the infill percentage. Material we don't really have to look at because we already chose it from this list. I'm not sure what the other settings are in here. Oh, it's if you want to tweak the temperature, and that's not really something you want to do as a beginner. So let me go ahead and close this one. Speed, I play with this sometimes. You want to be careful though. I've had students like try to run it at 100 or 80, and that's just kind of insane. I usually let the profile take care of it, but I have turned up the print speed. I've had students print at 80 millimeters per second. I don't like going that fast. And it also depends on what condition your printer's in. If it's running well and in super good condition, you can play with those. I usually don't. I leave it up to the profile. We won't look at travel or cooling. Okay, support is something we sometimes need to look at. We don't in this case. It has similar settings to infill, but build plate adhesion, we already chose the skirt, so that's where it is here. And if I click this because I need support, I get more choices here. We're not going to look at that right now because you don't need to. I think I turned it off. Yes, I did. So we'll collapse that. You don't really have to look at the rest of these unless you're interested. So I kind of think we have all of our choices done, and really everything you needed to look at was here, except for that layer height. So that's one of the reasons I always keep it on custom, is because these aren't the only things I look at. And if I do have support, I want to go into those support settings. But so yeah. Okay, at this point, what you would do is you would save to file. Now, normally you would have an SD card in your computer and you'd save it to that. But I want you to just save it somewhere on your computer. You can save it to the same place where you saved the STL. I don't like it that it has your name, that it has the TAS name. What I actually want you to get in the habit of doing, if you think you're going to print a lot, is put your first name and then put the color you think you'd want. And I have most colors, so put the color you think you want and save. Okay, I talked quite a bit. I'll stop this video. I'm going to do another one on lithophanes. It will be a much shorter video, but there's a lot to explain with slicing settings. So I'll stop this one and I will see you for the lithophane slice.